Hi, good evening, and welcome everyone. My name is Bonnie Efros, and I'm the Rothman Chair and Director of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere here at the University of Florida. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to hear Professor Priscilla Wald, who will be speaking in our series, which is called The Work of the Humanities, Critical Thinking in Life and Labor. So we'll open today with an introduction by Professor Pamela Gilbert, and who is the Albert Brick Professor in the Department of English at the University of Florida.
Introduction. This is the welcome speech, so you are hereby welcomed. I am very excited today to welcome Professor Priscilla Wald of Duke University to the University of Florida. I last saw Priscilla in Taiwan, where we were both speaking at a conference on health and illness and culture. She gave a luminous talk on Henrietta Lacks. We were there on a quick visit with a really busy itinerary, and I can get lost basically walking in my own neighborhood. So I was bemoaning the fact that even though we had some small holes in our schedule, I didn't think I was going to get to see very much of the city because I was afraid I would get lost, I wouldn't be back in time, et cetera, et cetera. So Priscilla, who was on an even tighter schedule than I was, and who was even more jet lagged than I was, said, well, we have an hour and a half, I have a bus schedule, and a city map. Let's go to the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, which was something that I really didn't think I had any desire to see, but I thought, well, all right, you know, we're going to see something. And lo and behold, we went briskly out into the city, and we arrived at the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, and it was a really sort of fabulous experience. And I learned a lot about the city that I would not otherwise have known. You know, we're very briskly walking through the memorial, and, you know, sort of strange combination of biographical stuff and memorabilia and kitsch and his favorite cars. And then at the end, you turn a corner, and suddenly you find that Chiang Kai-shek is still working at his desk in his office in life-size effigy. And something about that moment, which was a little uncanny, actually, a little unsettling, but something about that moment really crystallized that entire visit for me. I mean, it's confusing when you walk through other people's sort of state memorials and they're coming to terms with their own history, and it's hard to tell as an outsider kind of what to make of tone and what to make of the interaction of objects that people have decided to place together there. And something about that particular ending to the visit really sort of pulled together what they were trying to do with that memorial. And it's very much like every time I talk to Priscilla or every time I read her work, she takes me to someplace very unexpected, someplace I did not know I wanted to go in advance. But once I get there, I find out that I really wanted to go and have learned something and have a really unexpected perspective that I wouldn't have had without Priscilla's particular angle of vision, which is inclusive and wide and powerfully synthetic. So Priscilla's work falls squarely into the exciting interdisciplinary field of cultural studies of medicine, which at UF is included under the broad umbrella of what is often called medical humanities, although social sciences are a central part of that as well. Scientific medicine is obviously not a value-neutral field. It is central to the human life world, and as such it is deeply entrenched in cultural constructs of knowledge, ethics, and various public and private goods. Medicine is practiced by and on human beings, and over the past decades there have been calls from multiple sectors, most dramatically from faculties of medical schools, for a turn to the understanding of medicine as taking place in a human and humane context. That context is at the core of humanities study. Priscilla is particularly adept at promoting conversations among scholars from science, medicine, law, and the humanities. And I am very pleased to welcome her here as part of my participation in the new Collective for the Interdisciplinary Studies of Medicine and Culture here at UF, a group attempting to foster discussion in the intersection of the humanities and social sciences with medical science education and practice. Today's talk takes place in the context of the Center for Humanities and Public Sphere's annual speaker series, of which we'll hear more in a minute. The role of the humanities is to define how we wish to live, as well as how we do and have lived. And few questions confront us as urgently in this moment as how we define life itself. What does it mean to be human? What is the nature of nature? Is there something exceptional about life, or can it be subsumed under the sign of the commodity? Priscilla's work helps us confront these questions, and I welcome you all to what promises to be a lively evening. And now, here is Professor Bonnie Efros, Director of the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere, who will introduce Professor Wald.
So many of you have attended our earlier events in this series, but just to give it a little bit of context for those of you who haven't, the speakers in our series you have used the lens of the humanities to explore the changing workplace and the effect of technology on our lives. Our invited scholars have suggested innovative ways to approach and adapt to, or in some cases resist, fundamental changes in our day-to-day landscape. Today's workplace is a rapidly shifting environment, and the applications of digital technologies, telecommunication platforms, biotechnology, and robotics are creating new forms of human and worker interaction. Not only has the global marketplace created demand for new skill sets among employees and administrators, but it's opened new ethics challenges within this changing landscape. The humanities disciplines have valuable contributions to make to this culture of innovation and the associated uncertainty it brings about how our lives will evolve as a consequence. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted already, but I think it still needs to be said. Whether by questioning the role of new technologies, introducing nuance into discussions of the value of ethics, the value or ethics of new habits and expectations, or asking how technology-driven culture has altered what it means to be human, our series' 6 speakers show us that the humanities help us to navigate this brave new world. They offer us examples of how to listen, analyze, argue, and negotiate, and an appreciation of the lessons of literature, philosophy, history, religion, and many other humanities fields will enhance that experience, improve the quality of life and labor, and add value to the human experience in ways that we may have otherwise never have expected. Tonight's lecture by Professor Wald examines some of the biotechnical innovations that have blurred the line between science and science fiction since World War II. The atrocities of the 2 world wars and colonialism have framed public accounts of scientific innovation, not just in policy debates and legal cases, but also in mainstream media, popular fiction, and film. All of these genres attest to the convergence of scientific innovation and geopolitical transformation in new accounts of how to define life and what it means to be human. Following the court's patents of life created in laboratories, larger debates emerged from about the basic dignity of humankind and the future of human relationships. Professor Wald argues that science fiction writers have been at the forefront of those writing about the dangers and possibilities, the hopes and fears associated with science and scientific creation in the new age of biotechnology. And these literary interventions have helped to explain the radically changing figure of the human, forecast its destiny, and imagine the possibilities, constraints, and excesses of a biotechnological world. Before I introduce our guest, Professor Wald, I want to give some brief thanks, and very merited thanks, to the many people and organizations that have made tonight's event and those of the entire series possible. First, I'd like to give my thanks to Dr. Sophia Akerd, who makes everything possible, and also to Professor Sean Adams, who's here this evening too, now the chair of the history department, both of whom conceptualized the series, chose and invited speakers, found sponsors for the event, and especially Sophia, who organized so many details related to the series. I'd also like to thank our coordinators at the center, Tim Blanton at the back, and Sarah Harms somewhere in the audience, over there as well, who have helped so much at the Humanities Center, and as well as Class Shared Services, who do a lot of the legwork too that makes these events possible. Our series is made possible by many sponsors, and I'll list them. I apologize for the long list, but it shows that there's a lot of commitment here to the series. This includes the Rothman Endowment and the Yavitz Fund that's at the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere, along with co-sponsorship from the UF Informatics Institute, the Smathers Libraries, where we are today, the Honors Program, the College of Public Health and Health Professions, the Department of Political Science, Department of English, the Philip Wegner and Marston Milbauer Eminent Scholar Chair, the Department of Philosophy, the Department of Classics, Elizabeth B. and William P. Poe Center for Business Ethics, Education, and Research, the Albert Brick Professor, whom we just heard from just now with Pamela Gilbert, the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, UF Research Computing, and the Graham Center. Our next lecture, just to give you a heads up, will be given by Nancy Folbra from UMass Amherst, who will speak on unpaid and unpriced towards a feminist political economy on the 16th of March in Usler Hall Atrium. And just to give you a heads up as well, we've had to reschedule the talk by Cynthia Farrar, and that's now going to be on April 16th, but we'll send out lots of publicity before that event, but it won't be happening in February as originally planned. There will also be a question and answer period following the talk today. So it's always very rewarding to see events like today's come to fruition after long planning and anticipation. And I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Priscilla Wald, to Gainesville. Professor Wald is a professor of English and Women's Studies at Duke University, where she specializes in American literature and culture. She's the author of many works. I'll just name a couple here. Constituting Americans, Cultural Anxiety and Narrative Form, 1995, and more recently, Contagious Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative in 2008, in which she studies the evolution of the contemporary stories that we tell about the global health problem of emerging infections. At present, she's at work on a book-length study called Human Beings After Genocide, which chronicles the way in which scientific and technological innovations in the wake of the Second World War have challenged conceptions of what it means to be human. She's especially interested in analyzing how the language, narratives, and images in mainstream media promote a particular understanding of genomic science that is steeped in often misleading cultural biases and assumptions. She's committed to promoting conversations among scholars in science, medicine, law, and cultural studies, and the humanities more general, in order to facilitate a richer understanding of these issues. She served in a variety of capacities in the MLA, the Modern Language Association. She's currently the MLA representative to the American Council of Learned Societies. She recently served a term as president of the American Studies Association. And at Duke, she has appointments also in women's studies. She's on the steering committee of ISIS, which is Information Studies, Information Sciences and Information Studies, and she's a member of the Institute for Genome Sciences and Policy, and affiliate as well for the Trent Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities and the Institute for Global Health. So without further ado, I don't want to cut into her time anymore. I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Professor Priscilla Wald, who'll speak on More Human Than Human, the Work of Life in the Age of Biotechnical Reproduction.
Thank you, and I want to add my sincere thanks to all of the people Bonnie thanked and to Bonnie. I ended up coming 2 days early because of the snowstorm, and I'm not leaving, so it's been amazing. But people really have gone out of their way, and I deeply appreciate it, especially Sophia. Where's Sophia? But also everyone else. Thank you. We may well be living at the end of times, but we are certainly not the first to think so. From Ragnarok in the Norse Eddas and the Book of Revelations to December 21st, 2012 in the Mayan calendar, the end of the world is an old story, perhaps the oldest there is. But in characteristic mythic fashion, these stories oscillate between impending doom and reassurance of endless renewal. Even as scientific evidence has replaced the old prophetic modes, it remains difficult fully to accept the possibility of human finitude, or to take action to prevent it. Dying monarch butterflies or the near extinction of honeybees are troubling, but we sign petitions against Monsanto while we wait for technoscience to solve the problem. So it is not surprising that narrative has become an increasing focus for scientists and policy analysts seeking to craft a story that will lead to change. Recently, a story emerging from a proposed new designation in the geological timescale would put us in a new age. Succeeding the Holocene, and perhaps in its way the age of Aquarius, the Anthropocene marks the most recent attempt to tell the story of humankind's planetary impact as an account of unwitting destruction and deferred responsibility. But once again, we must ask, how to liberate doom from its mythic structure. How many of you have heard the term Anthropocene? Have you seen that term? So I hope I'll explain it well enough. If not, please ask in the Q&A. The historian Dipesh Chakrabarty put the idea of the Anthropocene into widespread circulation among humanists when he proclaimed the urgent need for a new account of human history that could better address the crisis of climate change. The vision of a world without us, with which the Climate of History 4 theses dramatically begins, challenges not only the ideas about the human that usually sustain the discussion of history, but also the analytic strategies that post-colonial and post-imperial historians have deployed in the last 2 decades in response to the post-war scenario of decolonization and globalization. If globalization and global warming are born of overlapping processes, Chakrabarty asks, how do we bring them together in our understanding of the world? How, that is, might the historian tell a story that reconciles the natural history of a species with the geopolitical history of culturally diverse populations? Species, Chakrabarty muses, may indeed be the name of a placeholder for an emergent, new, universal history of humans that flashes up in the moment of danger that is climate change. With evidence of climate change and its dangers saturating the media, it makes sense that the Anthropocene and environmental humanities generally have become part of the work of the humanities. The invocation of Walter Benjamin's asseveration, however, troubles Chakrabarty's claim of emergence, if not emergency. In his lyrical last essay, Theses on the Philosophy of History, Benjamin famously distinguished between the historicist effort to articulate the past the way it really was and the historical materialist attempt to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The memory threatens to disappear into the conformism that inscribes contemporary social and political hierarchies into a historicist narrative of inevitable progress. The historical materialist is, moreover, a stargazer, where the historicist looks for causal connections between historical moments. The historical materialist grasps the constellation which his own era has formed with a definite earlier one. The astral figure appears only to those who know how to connect the stars. Analogously, the historical materialist must learn to turn intuitive connections between past and present, expressed in the flash of a memory, into revelations about human experience. Benjamin surfaces as such a memory in Chakrabarty's essay, a disruption that, stargazing, I read against the grain of Chakrabarty's claim of an emergent, new, universal history for which species is a placeholder. The memory returns us to the mid-20th century, when the idea of a human species similarly rearticulated humanity through new narratives of natural and human history. 2 world wars had accelerated scientific innovations in genetics that spawned new theories of the development of the species. At the same time, political theorists pondered how best to formulate an idea of humanity that respected the diversity and equality of populations. Against the threat of global annihilation, their challenge was to fashion an account of humankind that did not superimpose political hierarchies on cultural difference. In the larger project from which I'm drawing today's talk, I show how the convergence of these scientific and political theories gave rise both to the emerging mass genre of science fiction and to new historical narratives of humankind. Reading these emergences together, I draw out a mythic inflection in the historical narratives that suffuses the definition of humanity. The historian Joseph Mali argues that the long history of historiography, in which myth and history have become antithetical terms, has obscured the way myth as a story of collective identity, values, and beliefs consistently passes into and becomes history. Reinvigorating an old term, myth history, to describe this phenomenon, he argues that these stories are inevitable and even valuable histories of personal and communal identity, but also subject to revision. Following Molly's usage, I show how the intermingling of scientific and political accounts of humanity produce mythic qualities, including invocations of the prehistoric and the divine or monstrous, and an oscillation between apocalypse and the reassurance of endless renewal. These features help to explain the unusual psychological power of the narratives, how they communicate the fundamental values and beliefs that define a collective identity, and why they are so difficult to challenge. The consummate theorist of the myth historical, Walter Benjamin, announces in his opening parable of the essay I was citing that the success of historical materialism depends on its enlisting the services of theology. Humanity is fundamentally defined as much by belief system as by material conditions. And he embodies his well-known messianic view of history in the by now iconic form of the angel of history, whose face is turned toward the past, where we, with our limited human perspective, perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. And I'll explain this a little more as I go on. The angel offers the possibility of revelation and redemption. Only a redeemed mankind receives the fullness of its past, but is forestalled by a storm blowing from paradise that has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. And I want to stop and say, because I see a lot of you are undergrads, right? I want to stop and say this is a really difficult essay, and I'm going to keep coming back to these images, but don't worry if you don't quite get it. Everyone I know, people I know, I have taught this essay in almost every class, or at least once a year for the last decade, and I still don't quite get it. You have to think about this essay kind of more the way you read poetry, for the way that you associate to its images. So please don't worry if you're not quite getting this. I hope it will get clearer as I go. And maybe to me too, so we'll see. He would like to stay, awaken the dead, make whole what has been smashed. But the storm called progress irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. Humankind's belief in progress, in the idea of civilization as inevitable enlightenment, obscures the angel's effort to tell the stories of those living and dead who have been forgotten by history, as it endlessly defers the revelation he wishes to enable. Benjamin's flashes of memory mark moments of insight into the angelic perspective which, if seized, offer the possibility for a redemptive revision of a myth-historical narrative. In today's talk, I will explore such a moment through the bioslave, a figure that expressed anxieties concerning the emerging business of biotechnology. In court cases, ethical discussions, the mainstream media, and popular culture, this figure represented the end of a much-evoked slippery slope from the commodification of living organisms produced in laboratories to owned human beings. I will conclude by showing how Ridley Scott's 1982 film Bladerunner, how many of you have seen that? Excellent. How the film explores the idea of the bioslave in a dramatic scenario that allows for an analysis of that figure as a constellation formed between biotechnology and the memory of racial slavery, thereby offering insight into the terms through which we might revise our own contemporary myth history. Natural history and its discontents. A fruit fly geneticist named Theodosius Dobzhansky rocked the scientific world when, in a series of lectures delivered at Columbia University in 1936, he brought genetic research together with natural history to address a problem that had long troubled advocates of Darwin's theory of evolution, the mechanism of natural selection. Darwin had written the great origin story of the 19th century, but he lacked the scientific evidence to support his theory that evolutionary change was gradual and continuous. Research in the emerging field of population genetics showed how a single mutation in one individual could ultimately result in a significant new characteristic of a population or even in a new species. The amount of time required for such a change varied depending on the reproductive cycle, much faster in fruit flies, of course, than human beings. But the principle was the same, and the conclusions dramatic. The story of humankind, like the species, was evolving. Julian Huxley named the theory in 1942 with the publication of Evolution, the Modern Synthesis. An especially effective proselytizer and popularizer, Huxley made accessible the processes through which a single mutation, a chance coding error, had gradually resulted in the separation of human beings not only from primates, but also from extinct lizards that had crawled out of the muck, and before that, single-celled organisms. Clearly, humanity was not the teleological climax of a completed world. The only biological certainty was that the long-term future, if there was one, would not resemble the past. Yet, new evidence notwithstanding, the story assumed a familiar form. Extinction or evolution, the scientific narrative of the human species evinced the characteristic mythic oscillation between impending apocalypse and endless renewal. Against this oscillation, Huxley worked to tell a more agentive story of human destiny. The ability to reflect on the concept of evolution, he argued, distinguished humankind from other living organisms and came with the ethical responsibility and destiny to be an agent for the rest of the world in the job of realizing its inherent potentialities as fully as possible. That's quotation. Natural selection, he cautioned, implied neither improvement nor extinction. Humankind, having by now become what he called the trustees of evolution, it fell to them to choose whether to be a constructive or destructive force in the process of evolution. Huxley carried his progressive vision for humankind into politics through his founding directorship of UNESCO, the UN Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The goal of international peace began for him with the recognition of the unity of mankind from both the biological and social viewpoints. But it was fundamentally the concept of the species that he believed could move humanity past its crippling differences. Fearing that evolutionary theory could in fact fuel powerful impediments to this goal, notably the race problem, Huxley, along with most of the other chief architects of the evolutionary synthesis, insisted on the contingency of populations and the distinction between scientific and popular uses of the idea of race. He coined the term ethnic group and advocated its use as a substitute for race in distinguishing among human populations. And he was a moving force behind UNESCO's revised statement, The Race Question, which sought to combat racism in part by dispelling semantic confusion, by distinguishing between biological populations and cultural groups. Huxley never relinquished a utopian faith in the implications of evolution properly understood. In 1957, he coined the term transhumanism to describe the cosmic self-awareness of the universe that made man the managing director of the biggest business of all, the business of evolution. Belief in transhumanism, he insisted, would supersede population thinking and thereby lead to the abolition of social ills and a deepening of human consciousness, elevating the human species to a new kind of existence as different from ours as ours is from that of Pekian man. For political theorists seeking to make sense of the human capacity for barbarism and self-destruction, however, neither semantics nor scientific literacy could prevent the dangerous dehumanization of entire populations enabled by superimposing natural on human history. Thinkers as diverse as the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, the Polish Jewish linguist and lawyer Raphael Lemkin, and the Martinican psychiatrist and decolonization theorist Frantz Fanon all argued for new narratives of humanity that would neither biologize nor subordinate the distinctions among populations, but would respectfully incorporate them. For them, wartime atrocities had demonstrated the fundamental inadequacy of the Enlightenment concept of natural rights. In the process, they called into question the narratives of natural history in which those rights were grounded and on which declarations of human universalism, such as the UNESCO statement, however well-intentioned, relied. In fact, they argued, the natural history foundation on which this view of humanism rested dangerously obscured the varied historical experiences that made certain populations uniquely vulnerable to atrocities. Arendt offered the specter of human beings deprived of their natural entitlements in the stateless or displaced persons created by the geopolitical reorganization of Europe following World War I. The mass migrations and expulsions resulting from long-simmering ethnic and racial tensions within nation-states left entire populations stateless and without the possibility of political asylum. These refugees haunted Europe and democracy generally as they embodied the failure of the concept of natural or human rights. They showed how the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. The idea of natural rights, she observed, endowed nature with a deifying transcendence. Nature as the guardian of humanity, natural laws as those that cannot be disobeyed. History, by contrast, showed the need for a basic human entitlement to dignity, without which there was no hope for the new law on earth, on which, she warned, the future depended. Lemkin similarly turned to history to show how the systematic atrocities perpetrated against vulnerable populations had long been obscured as a specific crime because of the lack of a name. He had watched the rise of the Nazi Party from Poland while serving as public prosecutor in Warsaw, as well as secretary of the Committee on Codification of the Laws of the Polish Republic. In 1933, he appeared before the Legal Council of the League of Nations to advocate for the crime of barbarity as a criminal category in international law. The argument became the basis for his definition of genocide, which he hoped would lead to legal codification. His efforts have been historically associated with Nazi atrocities, but in his writings he applied the term broadly to show in the long historical precedent for this crime, especially as a feature of colonialism, how a narrow definition of population contributed to its obscurity by making it difficult to recognize different kinds of group annihilation as the same crime. Lemkin's lobbying resulted in a UN convention that defined genocide broadly enough to encompass the destruction of a group's cultural heritage. The definition rested on the recognition that the coherence of a people relied on shared stories of a past that encode its collective values and beliefs, what Joseph Mali would call its myth history. The UN Convention tacitly affirmed the power of historical narrative as it mandated the respect for diverse populations conceived through genes or culture as the basis for a politics of a new world system. Fanon offered a trenchant analysis of cultural genocide when he illuminated the colonial tactic of inscribing both the cultures and the biology of the colonized in a narrative of natural history. Colonialism saw its past in the yellow man's reptilian motions, the stink of the native quarter, of breeding swarms of foulness, of spawn, of gesticulations, in hordes of vital statistics, hysterical masses, faces bereft of all humanity, distended bodies which are like nothing on earth, that vegetative rhythm of life. It thereby made every effort to bring the colonized person to admit the inferiority of his culture, which has been transformed into instinctive patterns of behavior, to recognize the unreality of his nation, and in the last extreme, the confused and imperfect character of his own biological structure. Like Arendt and Lemkin, Fanon believed the way forward lay in a revision of the narrative of the past. It fell to the third world, he argued in his revolutionary call to arms, to start a new history of man, a history which will have regard to the sometimes prodigious theses which Europe has put forward, but which will also not forget Europe's crimes, the differentiations, the stratification, and the bloodthirsty tensions fed by classes, racial hatred, slavery, exploitation, and above all, the bloodless genocide, which consisted in the setting aside of 15,000 millions of men. Such a story would be not merely a new account of the past. Rather, this history would constitute a new humanity. A new version of humankind would produce a new kind of human. Quite simply, Fanon explains, the replacing of a certain species of man by another species of man. Having attended medical school in the years following World War II, he would likely have at least encountered the new evolutionary theories, and he could well have had such ideas in mind when he formulated these changes in biological terms. Political transformation had to entail first an understanding of biology and nature as conceptual tools of oppression. The revolutionary process acts as the conceptual mutation that initiates the slow process of humanity's evolution. A new history encompassing diverse cultures without imposing a developmental narrative on them would subsequently lead to a metamorphosis of humankind itself, as all peoples would be allowed to flourish through self-respect and self-determination. Huxley's contention that the future of man must be guided by a deliberate purpose led him to eugenics, despite his anti-racism. With a deeper understanding of history, the more revolutionary Fanon advocated nothing less for the program of decolonization than harnessing the forces of evolution. Decolonization had to be a full-scale reconstitution, a historical process that influences individuals and modifies them fundamentally. It transforms spectators crushed with their inessentiality into privileged actors with the grandiose glare of history's floodlights upon them. It brings a natural rhythm into existence introduced by new men, and with it a new language and a new humanity. Decolonization is the veritable creation of new men. Decolonization, that is, had to rewrite human history in the textbooks and in the DNA. It had to entail a radical worldview and the production of a brave new world. Ironically, when scientists actually began to create new species in the laboratory, the narratives that emerged depicted their efforts not as liberatory, but on the contrary, as threatening to usher in a new form of slavery. What is human now? In the early 1970s, scientists working in laboratories at Stanford University and UC San Francisco completed the first successful acts of molecular cloning, recombinant DNA, transferring the genetic material of one living organism into another of a different species, in this case, E. coli, which is in all of our guts, and a carcinogenic monkey virus. Their earliest publications sparked considerable controversy, raising the question that had long haunted human thought in the form of such literary figures as Dr. Faustus, Dr. Frankenstein, and Dr. Rappaccini. Can that same imagination foresee the dangers their creations might introduce? As human beings created new life forms in the laboratory, those dangers ranged from the literal health risks posed by the wedding of an oncovirus and a common bacteria to the more metaphysical exploding of the familiar categories of existence, including, potentially, the idea of the human. Chastened by the devastation caused by the use of nuclear weapons during World War II, many researchers involved with the creation of recombinant DNA tempered their excitement with caution. The potential scenario of a highly contagious human cancer virus prompted Stanford researcher Paul Berg to postpone his experiments and organize a conference of researchers in the field to discuss the largely unprecedented possibility of imposing regulations on their own research. The conference, which became known as the Asilomar Conference of 1975, led to a moratorium on the most dangerous research until the NIH could establish guidelines to ensure public safety. It also generated a public narrative. Initial journalistic accounts of recombinant DNA and Asilomar echoed the scientists' concerns for the safety of the public, but what one writer dubbed the science-fictional fantasy of genetic engineering quickly metamorphosed into science fiction horror, as pundits speculated on these modern Frankenstein creations that scientists will literally be loosing on the world. Journalists mined popular culture for prototypes, as in a Newsweek piece entitled "Safe Houses for Strange Life." comparing the hazards of new and potentially dangerous forms of life created by genetic engineering with those brought to Earth from other planets, the article described plans for regional labs that could serve as safe houses for both genetic and interstellar monsters. It was unclear, however, whether these safe houses were intended to protect the American public from the monsters or the other way around. In fact, the anxieties surrounding biotechnology found particularly vivid expression in a figure, the bioslave, that looked backward to history for its precedent. As recombinant DNA research catapulted biotechnology into a multi-billion-dollar business, ethicists and science fiction writers worried about the metamorphosis that might emerge from new categories of existence as much as from laboratory experiments. In her 1977 Playing God, for example, June Goodfield brooded about the danger of patenting life forms. We can no longer possess, in the legal sense, a slave or a wife or any category of living things, she mused. But if we now can possess a group of living molecules and be protected by patent, is it not possible that commercial companies could slowly climb the evolutionary ladder with living organisms whose rights and development they wish to have solely? Central to her concerns was the fear that we are losing our respect for each other and for what it means to be human. She thereby heralded the terms that would emerge with increasing frequency in coming years. Lawyers and ethicists, for example, famously summoned the specter of bioslavery to argue both sides of a landmark legal case, Moore versus UCLA, which concerned the patent on a cell line derived from a white man's cancerous spleen. While Moore's lawyers sermonized against the slippery slope of bioslavery if someone else held property rights in their client's cells, the defense team declaimed the danger of that slope if the courts were to reorganize ownership even in one's own body parts. And my students went wild with this case this semester. They read through it and they said, wait a minute, everybody's using the word property differently. Some people are talking about material property. Some people are talking about intellectual property. These are completely different things. And my co-teacher and I went, yup. And they said, but this is the Supreme Court of California. Like, what? And we went, yup. And they said, and they don't get the science. And we went, yup. It was revelatory. One of them is rethinking law school. I told her, no, go to law school. Come on, we need you. The danger of the chimeras, clones, and other actual and fantastic creatures of the biotechnological revolution came less from any actual harm they might do to the world in which they would circulate than from their embodied challenge to the definitions of life and the human, and therefore to conventional categories on which social structures and ideas about social justice rested. The influential futurist Alvin Toffler, for example, decried the hidden dangers of biotechnology in the creation of new life forms with genes drawn from humans, which, he cautioned, could blur the commonly, mainly implicit definition of humanness. Murder can be redefined if the victim is regarded as not human. Slave labor is not slavery if the slaves are not human. And in reference to the legal case of Moore, if we can sell parts of ourselves, why not the entire body? And if body parts can be sold separately, why not the whole for 21st century bioslavery? More human than human. The slippery slope from ethical speculation about science to the science fictional scenario of bioslavery makes sense when we remember, as Hannah Arendt suggested in The Human Condition, that the emerging mass-market genre of science fiction served as an especially noteworthy vehicle of mass sentiments and mass desires. Of course, Frankenstein and other works of proto-science fiction showed how anxieties concerning the manipulation of living organisms had long preceded the last decades of the 20th century. From the beginning of the 19th century, when Victor Frankenstein realized his ambition to create life in the laboratory, through Giacomo Rappaccini's cross-pollination of his daughter with poisonous flora, that's a Hawthorne story, to Dr. Moreau's horrific metamorphoses of animals into people at the century's end, H.G. Wells, literary works showed how the scientists' hubristic zeal blinded them to the suffering their experiences produced. But prototypes notwithstanding, the genetically engineered bioslave was a creature particular to the concerns of biotechnology and the myth-historical narrative through which it was articulated. No work better captured the anxieties crystallized in this figure than Bladerunner, a film that traffics heavily in the mythic. Adapted from Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The film, like the novel, explores the loss of humanity and devaluation of life generally in a dystopic future, but with a more pronounced emphasis on biotechnology. While nuclear war has caused the all but uninhabitable Earth of the novel, in the industrial wasteland with which the film opens, design master Ridley Scott depicts accumulation rather than causality in a pile of debris growing skyward. In both cases, environmental degradation has prompted the formation of off-world colonies, hence the need for cheap and expendable labor and the consequent production of Dick's androids and Scott's deliberately renamed replicants. And Dick's innuendo, an advertisement for androids that summons the halcyon days of the pre-Civil War Southern states, becomes the film's full-blown scenario. The genetically engineered replicants are human entities mass-produced explicitly as slaves. As scientists and cultural commentators had feared, the circumstances of their creation allow their creators to overlook the attributes that make them human. A slave rebellion generates the action of the film, which pits Bladerunner Rick Deckard against the 4 replicants who have survived the rebellion and have returned to Earth to find their maker, hoping to extend their 4-year lifespan. The film shifts the novel's predominant focus on Deckard to include the replicants, who are more sympathetic than their counterparts in the novel, and Eldon Tyrell, the more sinister head of the corporation that produces them. The replicants Deckard has been assigned to retire are all Nexus 6s, Tyrell's new line, and the Bladerunner learns how difficult his task will be when he is nearly fooled by Tyrell's Nexus 6 assistant Rachel, who is unaware of her heritage. As Tyrell chillingly explains, commerce is our goal here at Tyrell. More human than human is our motto. Rachel is an experiment, nothing more. An exceptionally cruel feature of their engineering makes the subterfuge possible. We began to recognize in them a strange obsession, Tyrell explains. After all, they are emotionally inexperienced, with only a few years in which to store up the experiences which you and I take for granted. If we gift them with the past, we create a cushion or pillow for their emotions, and consequently, we can control them better. Deckard's outburst, "Memories! You're talking about memories!" signals the master Bladerunner's increasing sense of a violation. The Tyrell Corporation develops the fail-safe device of the 4-year lifespan to protect humanity from the emotional responses their slaves might develop. The cruelty is evident in Rachel's poignant efforts to convince Deckard of and reassure herself about her humanity by producing a photograph of herself as a child with her mother. But Deckard offers irrefutable evidence in his identification of her childhood memories, things she has told no one, as those of Tyrell's 6-year-old niece. Both are devastated by the revelation, as they come to understand the means by which the corporation has excluded the replicants from the basic terms of humanity as an act of violence. Violence begets violence. Deckard is called back from retirement because of the near-fatal shooting of the top Bladerunner while administering a test to determine which employees of the Tyrell Corporation are the Nexus 6s who have infiltrated it. Seeking to measure emotional response, ostensibly the distinction between human beings and replicants, the examiner asks the subject, Leon, a series of questions, including one about his mother, which prompts him to shoot the Bladerunner. The unfolding film makes retrospective sense of this act as it educates us, along with Deckard, about the nature of human on replicant violence. Leon's action is more than an effort to escape. It is an expression of anguish. The question about his mother summons a memory he knows to be false. a taunting reminder of his exclusion from history, and thus the social death that marks his enslavement. Insofar as they figure the external sign of the replicant's implanted memories and trigger their emotions, photographs depict distinctive moments of danger in the film. Leon is willing to risk capture to save his photographs of his past, despite the knowledge that the memories they mark are mostly false. The leader of the escaped team, Roy Batty, scoffs at Leon's attachment to them. After all, they represent the replicant's internalization of the fictions of the Tyrell Corporation, their longing for a past through which the corporation seeks to control them, which is to say, the emotional terms of their enslavement. But Roy comes to understand that the nature of the corporation's violence inheres in its converting the terms of the replicant's humanity into the terms of their enslavement. The script draws on the prophetic books of the poet William Blake to show how Roy's bid for survival becomes a quest for humanity. Fiery the angels fell, Roy intones, slightly altering a line from Blake's 1793 poem, America, a Prophecy, as he enters the factory that produces replicant eyes. Deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fire of Orc. Blake's Orc, a revolutionary figure who eschews the deadening attributes of both religious commandments and secular law, appears sinister to the oppressive forces of civilization. America, a Prophecy begins with his breaking his chains and inspiring the American Revolution. Throughout the poem, he embodies the creative human spirit struggling for liberation. The association identifies Roy and his fellow replicants as angels of revolution. Capable of raw brutality and fierce love, Roy is nonetheless the moral center of Bladerunner and its prophetic voice, angelic and finally redemptive. The transformation happens during his confrontation with Tyrell. Despite Roy's clear-sightedness about replicant memories, he consistently gives the lie to replicants' alleged affectlessness, and the intensity of emotions in the encounter is palpable. And I apologize, we have not been able to get the sound to work. If you listen, you'll hear a little sound coming from out of there, but I have captions. So. You might hear a whisper. Roy is at once suppliant and rejected child. His request for extended life is at the same time, like Frankenstein's creature, a plea to turn his maker into a father. The hopelessness of Roy's quest is evident even in Tyrell's name, which again, drawing on one of Blake's prophetic poems, invokes Tyrael, the tyrant king who enslaves his many children and eventually causes most of their deaths. Tyrell, of course, misses Roy's point. The request for more life, he chides, is a little out of his jurisdiction, and the ensuing conversation reads like something out of the Asilomar Conference as he enumerates dangers worthy of any science writer's paranoia. In his effort to console his creature, Tyrell reveals the nature of his violence. The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long, he tells Roy, and you have burned so very, very brightly, Roy. Look at you. You're the prodigal son. You're quite a prize. To Roy's pained confession, I've done questionable things, he counters also extraordinary things, and he advises Roy to revel in his time. Roy's icy response, nothing the god of biomechanics wouldn't let you in heaven for, shows he apprehends his maker's lack of humanity, as well as the violence of the structures that perpetuate it. The depth of Roy's emotion is evident in the metamorphosis of a passionate kiss into a graphically intimate blinding. Gruesome as the scene is, the punishment fits the crime. Tyrell has failed him as father, maker, and corporate executive. He has not only failed to understand Roy's anguish, his regret for the crimes Tyrell's work has forced him to commit, but he is also blind to the agon of Roy's existence as a sentient being with someone else's past, which is to say, an enslaved person longing for, but excluded from, the most fundamental terms of history and the most intimate relationships of humanity. Last section, Angel of History. If this act of violence grows out of Roy's recognition that Tyrell is motivated not, as many of his science fiction predecessors, by the passion of a mad scientist, but by the dispassion of a corporate head, Rachel is an experiment, nothing more, it is also an act of vengeance. Any moral edge is, moreover, undercut by his ostensible murder of the one witness to his act, the meek toy maker Sebastian, who has befriended him and taken him to Tyrell. The close-up of the eye of an unseeing, because mechanical owl following the murder of Tyrell signals the missed possibility of the act in the surrender to the vengeance motive and the destruction of the witness. Film critics are often puzzled when Roy chooses at the end of the film to save Deckard at the end of what appears to be a bloody fight to the death. But I read this decision in light of the regret he expresses to Tyrell at what he has had to do to survive, and thus as a turning point. Roy had come to Earth to protest replicant treatment and demand more life. When his encounter with his father and maker becomes a meeting with a corporate head, however, he comes to understand the structural violence, to borrow Johann Galtung's term, that has created the depleted world in which others, the toy maker, the Bladerunner, the engineer in the iWorks factory, pickpockets and street urchins, not just replicants, are trying to survive. Earlier, he had taunted the eye engineer, Chu, with his nearsightedness, quipping, "If only you could see what I have seen with your eyes." But in his final words, he bears witness and asks Deckard to do the same. This is the last clip. Capable of discerning astral figures, a transformed Roy expresses resignation but not despair. Acknowledging that he is, in all senses of the word, out of time, he hopefully bequeaths his cosmic perspective to Deckard, whose subsequent revelation that he may himself be a replicant proves his fitness for the inheritance. Roy's story, like that of the eponymous and myth-historical figure of Wagner's opera, Tannhäuser, may yet prove a tragic but hopeful story of the redemptive power of love. The decision to save Deckard makes sense, that is, if we understand Roy not only as Blake's angel, but also as Benjamin's. The perspective that turns the angel of revolution, Roy, into the angel of history parallels the arc of Benjamin's essay, and the echo of the chess game in Benjamin's opening parable in the ruse by which Roy gains access to Tyrell, a chess game that he ventriloquizes through Sebastian, is even tempting to read as homage. But whether the echo is intended or not, Roy's perspective is what Benjamin calls messianic. Having come to rebel against this world, he learns he must also seek to redeem it. He must, that is, undertake the work of awakening the dead. With its emphasis on replicants as slaves, Bladerunner is a memory flashing up in the dangerous moment of biotechnology, and Roy's encounter with Tyrell mediates the nature of the constellation. No slope slips from patenting life to owning a human being, as June Goodfield had foretold, and the danger of bioslavery does not lie in the idea of human being as property. Rather, the replicant sees in Tyrell the indifference to human or any other life that has yielded the blasted world of Bladerunner, the wreckage upon wreckage of slavery, colonialism, genocide, but also more mundanely, although no less violently, of the inequities of lived experience that continue to trace the historical contours of exploitation. That is what is obscured. Where, for example, both sides in the Moore case decried the science-fictional scenario of the slippery slope of bioslavery, no one followed the logic of the flashing memory to where I am suggesting Bladerunner leads us. The constellation formed between the differential value of human life that enabled the colonization and enslavement of populations and their descendants' disproportionate exclusion from the benefits of biotechnological research that the business of biotechnology made increasingly difficult to afford, healthcare, for example. It is, of course, important to remember that the angel Roy is also and always a replicant, whose memories, flashing or otherwise, are implanted. Yet he is throughout the visionary, who sees with the engineer's eyes, who witnesses the cosmic spectacles we can only imagine, and through whose eyes Deckard and we come to see ourselves. The vision bequeathed to us as to Deckard is the uncertainty of our humanity. Replicants all, we dwell in history, which is to say our memories, at least collectively, are indeed implanted. As replicant, slave, and angel, Roy reveals the ontological investment in memory, collective as individual, that would make someone risk everything for a photograph, even while knowing it as a fiction. It shows us, that is, our own investments in myth history. I began this talk with Chakrabarty's urgent call for a new story of humanity that adds to the mandate for the respectful incorporation of cultural diversity the need to acknowledge humankind as a collective responsible for its uncertain future. To that end, he offers species as a placeholder for an emergent new universal history of humans that flashes up in the moment of danger that is climate change. Through this term, he asks us to imagine the unthinkable extinction event of the world without us. Species, that is, invokes a crisis narrative, a state of emergency, which, as Benjamin reminds us, is not the exception, but the rule. Prehistoric and apocalyptic, moreover, the Anthropocene he describes risks the mythic oscillation that forecloses the possibility for change. Bladerunner, by contrast, populates the future world with our descendants and asks us to look backward at ourselves in the present as though we are the past. Its noir aesthetic depicts a future recursively stuck in the past. Throughout my talk, I have aligned this proleptic vision, a familiar one in science fiction, with the perspective of Benjamin's angel. And I want to conclude by considering what might happen if we replace Chakrabarty's placeholder species with angels, as we have arrived at this term from Benjamin and Blake to Bladerunner. Both species and angels, of course, designate new ways of revising the myth history of our contemporary global moment. Both concede an uncertain future. The angelic perspective, however, offers the possibility for revision in the backward glance that replaces a crisis narrative with an account of what the critic Rob Nixon calls slow violence, the accumulation of inequities, wreckage upon wreckage, piling skyward. We're repeating the same mistake over and over again. That's what the angel sees. This perspective converts the species question of whether we will survive into a choice of what world we want to bequeath. Acknowledging the magnitude of the problem, it alters the scale of address and shows how a new story might lead to change. The angelic perspective might better enable humanities scholars to undertake the work that remains for us and for future students in the age of the Anthropocene to accomplish: the full integration of environmental and social justice into a multifaceted, multivocal critique of daily existence in a world system, and for us in the U.S. in particular, in an American culture, as it now is, in its descent from the imperial heights of the immediate post-war era into its changing role into that new world system, a role we must help to define. The angelic perspective might help us ensure that the new history or myth history for which Chakrabarty calls includes a mandate for justice, for a method of investigation rooted in compassion and accountability, for an acceptance of the human as an element of an ever-evolving planet, so that we might imagine contra-world alienation, a way of writing and thinking that the state of the very air, water, earth, and all that lives on, above, or beneath it begs us to develop. Thank you.
I believe that we have time for Q&A if anybody has any questions for our speaker.
And it was a dense talk, so I'm happy to unpack. Yeah.
Explain the concept of bioslavery.
Sure. So bioslavery is a term that gets coined. The first reference I've found to it, and she doesn't use that actual term, is in the June Goodfield in 1977. But around the John Moore case, which was in the 80s, people began, and Toffler, and so it's in around the time of really turn of the 70s into the 80s, as biotechnology is taking off as big business. People begin to talk about bioslaves instead of to mark the idea that we are creating the entities we're going to enslave. So the idea is we are going to turn people. So the perfect example is Bladerunner. We're going to create human beings that, because we've created them in a laboratory, we don't think of as human and can therefore enslave. So there's really no difference between slave and bioslave, except that it's there to mark the role of biotechnology in the production, commodification, instrumentalization of life as the thing that has led us back into an institution we thought we'd left behind. Does that make sense? And what I'm arguing about that is that that's not what we should be worrying about. That's a science fictionalization of the news, right? Science fiction is great because it represents itself as fiction, and it tells us, like, yeah, the thing I'm talking about is hypothetical, it's fiction. It allows us a lens onto these issues that we can really think about. But when you start getting legal cases, bioethics, the media, imagining real-life problems as this kind of science fictional horror, you get deflected from what you should be worrying about. So my argument, for instance, about the John Moore case is that you look at this, what they did was they patented they created a cell line from his cells that survive and reproduce outside his body, and then they patented. And what this confusion was that my students were so astonished by was that somehow they were all trying to figure out what this thing was, and they were using different ideas of property to think about it. So saying that you have a patent on that restricts access to it. That's intellectual property. What Moore's lawyers were arguing is, well, you're going to go on a slippery slope to owning John Moore. If you can own his cells, which isn't what a patent is, you can own John Moore. My concern was, while everybody's arguing that science fiction scenario, they're not thinking about how a patent is actually reproducing the legacy of slavery in what I call structural terms or institutional terms. So you have the institution of slavery. It sets a certain population, it deprives a whole population of education, of certain kinds of jobs, et cetera. And then you don't have anything that allows that population to catch up. So therefore, you continue to reproduce these discrepancies. They get wider and wider, and you get an entire population that, if you look statistically, has less access to health care, greater infant mortality rates, more likely to live next to a toxic dump, et cetera, than the enslaving population. That is, so what I would have liked to see, and what I think Bladerunner brings us to, is the discussion of the patent being, how is this going to affect the cost of health care? How are disenfranchised populations going to get even more disenfranchised, and that gap grow wider and wider? Does that make sense? And so the science fictionalization of the case is what I think gets exposed in the logic of Bladerunner, where we should be looking. Yeah. Shout, please. Huxley. That was Huxley. Yeah. Of the eugenics. So Huxley is a really interesting figure. He's Aldous Huxley's brother, by the way, Brave New World brother. Julian. And so he's a biologist, but he also is a politician or, sort of world leader. And what's so interesting about him is he's a working biologist. He's the person who names this evolutionary synthesis, writes the book that everybody's reading. Dobzhansky's book was for specialists. Huxley popularizes it. And then he goes on to be the first director general of UNESCO. And he's very, very lefty. And what he's trying to argue is, natural rights didn't work, but if we all understand that we're all part of the same species, we'll be able to overcome our cultural differences. My argument about him is he's not really paying attention to the narrative, the myth history. And all the other people I talked about, Lemkin, Fanon, Hannah Arendt, they're all understanding that it's all about how you tell the story. You can't solve the problem by teaching people biology. You haven't understood how racism and oppression work. So what Huxley, how he understands eugenics, he was an anti-racist, he's working against racism, but for him, eugenics is all part of this utopian vision of, we're going to get rid of disease. People aren't going to think about race. We're not going to use it that way. We're more enlightened than that. We're going to understand we're all part of a species, and we're going to be able to get rid of disease. So eugenics for him was only about thinking about, Tay-Sachs or, find the gene for something and get rid of it. And we won't allow babies to be born. We'll be able to test, and, this is actually true, right? We'll be able to test for these diseases, and then people, won't be born who have them, and then we won't have disease in our world, and we'll have cosmic bliss and transhumanism and a disease-free world. What he didn't understand was how people were going to use eugenics. That you can't dissociate it from its narrative. Of course. All the different things that a disease, that the gene in a different form that mutation confers a benefit. Right. He certainly did not. I mean, they're pretty early in the genetics research at this point. But he was really well-intentioned. My students really get very mad at him, and I say, well, give the guy a break. Like, he was trying. But to solve this problem through biology, he just felt, if only people understand the biology, we won't have racism. And that's just naive. Well-intentioned, but naive. So, yeah.
Professor George Church, geneticist at Harvard, wrote a book called Eugenics. It's actually very fascinating on the future of synthetic biology, and he talks about all the different ways in which we can ease human suffering, such as engineering immune cells, reimplanting them into humans, and having humans that are resistant to certain diseases. Do you think this is going to compound the problem that we have now with the cell lines that are being patented and with bioslavery, or do you think we should continue searching along this path of easing and prolonging human life?
So that's a great question. I do not, thanks for the question, so I can say this really clearly. I really separate the scientific research from the business. The problem is not the research. The problem was not that people could create cell lines. That's been great. The problem is that people patented cell lines and that it became a multi-billion-dollar business and that the cost from that rolled into healthcare. So the problem that I'd like to see us addressing is how do we solve the healthcare access problem? How do we think about, how might we think differently about patents and the work that patents do? We can't just get rid of them tomorrow. We'd have, everything would collapse, right? The corporations would go under. There'd be no one funding the research. But how could we, over a period of time, rethink funding sources such that we might be able to address patents and other things that are driving healthcare costs up? So I'm all for doing the research. I have a friend who's really sick right now and is benefiting incredibly from immune therapy, where they take out his own, he has a brain tumor, malignant brain tumor. They're taking out his immune cells and ramping up his immune system to fight the cancer. That's fantastic, right? That's not where the problem is. The problem is when this becomes a multi-billion-dollar business and how to dissociate those things. I don't have an answer for it, but I think if we at least begin to look at the narratives that reinforce it and think of other ways of telling these stories about research, about funding, about what human beings are entitled to, it's a beginning. So, yeah.
So therefore, you're not against getting modification or engineering or anything like that?
Not out of hand.
So if it's done not for gain, it's fine with you.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
The example of golden rice is one which I'm sure you've heard.
I would approve of I approve of it. So in other words, I'm not pro or, I'm not anti or con, right? Pro or con, whatever. I'm not pro or con, right? It depends on the research like anything else, right? So I wouldn't say I'm in favor of any kind of scientific research without any thought whatsoever, nor would I say I'm opposed to genetic research or bioengineering out of hand. Neither, right? That's not the point. That's not where the problem is. Again, the problem is the social justice questions that are related to the economics of that. The science questions are separate from that. So, again, scientific research, it depends on what they're doing, right? If it's, the Nazis doing research on, some population without anesthesia, yeah, I'm against that, right? So it totally depends on the context.
Thank you for your talk. I would like to know your opinion about bioslavery and how that interacts with the food industry.
With the food industry?
Or if that appears at all with animals or plants.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. This talk is about the human, right? Bioslavery is about the human. Animal rights is something different to me. I think it's really important, but it's not the same question for me as human rights. It's a separate discussion. It's certainly, I'm really glad people are having that discussion. It's not where my work is. I mean, I read it, and it's great, and it's useful, and it intersects, but I draw a distinction between humans and animals. Food politics is really interesting, and that fits because, and again, this isn't an area I do research in, but it's all part of a social justice question, and the golden rice is an example of where biotechnology meets food products. I think some of the same problems that I'm seeing here, at least analogously, are with the genetically modified organisms, right? And the way that one of the things that's really interesting and very apparent if you read the John Moore case is that the decision of whether or not who should profit from this line is entirely driven by biotechnology. There's only, that whole question of bioslavery comes up, but the judges that want to rule against Moore are really arguing for this is really important for business, and that's ultimately, what we have to think about. There's an earlier case called Chakrabarty in 1980, which got all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. This other Moore case was the California Supreme Court. And Chakrabarty was the first, and it was a 5-4 decision, so as close as it can get, and it was all about whether you could patent a living organism. Chakrabarty had engineered a bacterium that could digest oil, and he wanted to patent it, or his lawyers wanted, his company wanted to patent it. And the Patent Trade Organization said, you can't patent a living organism. That's like against patent rules. It went to the Supreme Court case. They said, yes, you can. Entirely driven by business interests. So I have some of the same problems when I look at Monsanto, for example, and the genetically modified organisms. It's entirely driven by business. The golden rice is a different question, right? That has humanitarian considerations, that involves what can help feed a starving population. That's something different, right? Those are not utterly divorced. Sometimes corporations are making the right decisions. I don't want to say they're all evil. Monsanto, I haven't ever seen them make a good decision, to be honest. There are some corporations that are just bad. I'm on camera saying this. I don't care. I don't like Monsanto. But maybe if I did more research, I'd find some good thing they've done. I don't know. But there's always good in some, everyone has a little good, right? But there are some corporations, that are doing good things. So I want to see the context. But the analogous thing would be the food politics and what's driving it. And that's, again, that's my interest. Yeah. Can you shout? Yes.
Being getting more and more polarized and not in dialogue with each other.
Absolutely.
And if perhaps instituting curriculum changes that helps those disciplines speak to each other more, would reach or help bridge the difference between scientists thinking in terms of ethical or other decisions as well as business, those kinds of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Whether you're talking about ethics, or in my case, I'm much more interested in narrative. Right? I mean, bioethics is a piece of it, but it's not really what I do. I'm looking at the stories we tell and how the stories we tell influence what we believe. You can also, that's useful, not just, ethically or in terms of justice, but if you're a scientist and you're doing research and you want some perspective on, the experiment you're doing, you're not getting the results you thought, you don't understand why, you want to think about the problem a different way, stepping back and thinking about what story you're telling about your research and how you might tell it differently can actually open up, your research in a new way. So in every possible way, I think the humanities and the sciences, humanities, that we need to reintegrate our disciplines. And what I'm seeing that's really heartening to me is, I've had a series of meetings with undergraduates at Duke where I teach, and I say to them, what would you like to see in the humanities? And they all say much more intermixture. We want more classes in the humanities that are looking at science narratives and looking at policy narratives. And every conference I go to on environmental policy, I hear everybody saying we really have to figure out how to change the narratives. Then we can start changing minds. Well, that's interdisciplinary, right? That's what we study, how to change a narrative, how to think about a narrative, how to recognize a narrative, right? We in the humanities. So it's, I think you're absolutely right, but I also hear those requests coming from undergraduates that we don't like our education so polarized. I'm hearing that all over the place. I taught a class on science, law, and lit, co-taught with an MD and policy person, and our class was absolutely, it was predominantly science, but we had, a third were humanities students. We had a couple of policy people, and then we had a bunch of scientists who really, really, really wanted to learn how to approach their work in this way. So, yeah. One more?
Yeah.
Bonnie? Hi.
I was trying to put together the sort of two parts of your talk. The first part, which dealt a lot with Iran and colonialism in a specific sense, as in colonized populations and populations divided by race. And the second part of your talk, which used colonization more in the sense of exploited populations, not necessarily, marked by race. Or colonialism.
Then I came across wrong, because I meant it consistent. I wanted to use the historically colonized populations all the way through. So I must have said something wrong.
No, I must have missed something. Because, and in Blade Runner, how does that work in Blade Runner? It's been a while since I've seen it, so I just my memory could be totally off. But I just distinctly remember the setting up of the dystopia as really orientalized.
Yes.
And
There are ways,
how does that
yeah.
go along with this sort of redemptive vision that you're
Right.
talking about?
So I see a difference. That was Ridley Scott. That was his vision, right? So the script is where I see the redemptive work. I think that there are huge problems, like in a longer version of this, I take that up. There are huge problems with how Ridley Scott is envisioning that future that had a lot to do with the Japanese were in the process of buying real estate in New York. It's racist. And Ridley Scott, that I think comes out in the aesthetic of the film. So in a longer version, I deal with that. But what I'm getting at here with just the portrayal of Roy, where the redemption is, that's the script. And that's that script does not call for that image of the future. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So in other words,
grabbing Ridley, grabbing Roy sort of in that messianic manner and saying, let's leave the other side.
So I'm talking about the story of the film, and I'm not, in this, I took out working with the way that the aesthetic of the film is problematic. Well, that's a good question. I'm trying to work that out. I would say yes, that what's happening, how they're imagining the interactions among the characters in the film. I think that the tension is actually interesting because it shows the way in which the myth historical is complicated. You can retell the story to a certain extent, but you're not leaving. Part of my point about the myth historical is it's inevitable. My argument is how I understand, we were talking about this today, how I understand social justice is not we're going to arrive at a place where we've got a utopian solution. It's that it's messy, it's problematic, we have different and conflicting visions, and we have to stay in dialogue and keep working it through. So in that sense, I think the film is a perfect illustration of, it gets it right in one place and not in another. It's an ongoing process of analysis. We're never going to arrive. It's the process, which is where, social justice is located. It's the ongoing, constant challenge to the narratives, not accepting anyone as having gotten it right. So in that sense, I think the film is a really good illustration. It gets the biotech, the continuation of slavery, the structural violence right, and it doesn't finished because there's this alternative racism that is coming out of an economic anxiety. So it isn't finished. That the way that economic anxiety is racialized. And so it doesn't finish its job. That's what I would say. Yeah. Can I do one more? Okay. You can ask me. Okay.
I just want to have everybody join me in thanking Professor.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you.